Hey, what's up, nerds? Paul here at Radio Free Hammer Hall. I just wanted to do kind of some quick takes after about a day with the Citadel Contrast Paints. Had a couple of painting sessions with them now, and I wanted to give my initial thoughts on them. So, what I've used them so far on was starting to speed paint my Plague Monks to get those on the table. I used them a bit on a plague priest for my Skaven army, and then as well trying to use them on my plague furnace. So it basically levels of success in that order. Like the best has definitely been speed painting the plague monks. They're um the right level of detail, the right amount of not caring about the really tight details of these models that I think this is perfect for. It's overall, it's kind of like using a thick wash or a thick shade paint. Um, so it's very much like using the shades, except it's a more vibrant color. Um, I did not have nearly as much success working with it on my plague furnace. I think just the size of the detail on the plague furnace really was not lending itself to that kind of paint working well. I tried using the wildwood paint on all of the wood on the plague furnace, but that's basically large flat surfaces with wood grain, and so it didn't really come out as nicely as I'd want it to. It definitely lost some of the detail. It just came out much darker than I would want it to. It does a beautiful job, like on. I'll just hold up my test model of my plague monks. It did a great job on his staff. Like that looks really nice. That was just one coat of contrast paint on that with wildwood, but contrasting that use of contrast against what does it look like on this, it's just not as great. And on like the warp stone and warp fire bits of this, I had used the warp lightning color, and I not that I didn't like how it came out, because I think it worked fine. I can just show you what the plague sensor looked like real quick. You're getting the detail picked out. You're getting some decent amounts of highlights, lowlights. Getting some shadows in there, and they seem to mostly be in the right places. The problem just really comes in that let's just do a quick comparison. So here is my screaming bell, and then compare the color. Like the color of that warp flame just is not at all matching what I was already doing on my other Skaven models. So that's my main reason that I'm going to be not using that color for that particular purpose. I think the execution came out okay. It was just a color match problem. Um, so there's definitely some things that I've noticed that are really good about it, and there's some things that I think are going to be major challenges for people working with this. Um, there is a reason that I have not heard anybody else mention yet as to why the two new spray primers that they came out with, they also made base paints of the same color. People are like, why did they do that? I will tell you what those are. Those are erasers. If your contrast paint gets anywhere that it's not supposed to be, then you basically have to go in and reprime that area to actually get the color, like the next contrast color, to actually work if you're using multiple different contrast colors. otherwise the two colors are going to blend and look like a ugly smudge. So it's definitely a challenge. Like you need to, a lot of times when you're working with contrast, you're going to need to go in, you do your contrast color, and then you have to go back and clean up the detail that all got, if you had anything run over or pool in a weird place, you've got to like reprime that area and then move on to your next contrast color if you're doing, multiple contrast colors that are going to be abutting each other. Um, and if you're using it for other things, then it's going to be okay. Like you can, just put like a layer paint over it and it's no big deal. I think the dry time is definitely longer than a lot of other Citadel paints are. So I think that major problem that I have been running into with needing to kind of have that primer eraser is one that I think is going to be not obvious to a lot of people right up front. The nice thing though about like those particular properties of this paint, where like, if you paint over something that has a color already there, like it's going to change that color because what you're working with is a very translucent paint. It's very much like using a shade. So if you're undercoating that color with something else, like for example, it's hard to see here, but on these plague monks, on the fleshy bits, I undercoated that in Xandri dust, and then I used the flesh contrast over it, and that made it like a darker, more brown shade of contrast, like a darker flesh tone. And I think that worked well. And I think you can do that with a lot of these paints where you can shift the color that you get at the end with the contrast paint by undercoating it with some other relatively light color. So if you're working with a, maybe like warp lightning, for example, if you put a yellow underneath that before you put the warp lightning on top of it, it's going to make it look like a more yellow green. Maybe warp lightning is a bad example because this is actually a fairly pigment heavy one of the contrast paints. There is major variation in the contrast paints between which ones are like really thick, opaque, and put tons of pigment on the model, and ones that are very thin and are not putting a lot of color on, which with each application. I swear I can speak. I do it all the time. So I think there's going to definitely be some uses for it. There's going to be some challenges with it. So as I said, the really good uses I think are going to be using it for anything where you might use a shade or an ink already, and it's like another color set of things that have very similar properties. It's basically, it feels to me very much like a thicker shade. It has more pigment in it. It's a little bit higher surface tension, so it's not going to be as runny as the shades are, and I think it's going to cover better because it has more pigment in it. At least it looks like it has more pigment in it. I'm not a chemist. I don't know. There's definitely going to be challenges where if you get things like a color where it's not supposed to be and you're trying to use a lot of contrast paints, one contrast paint over another contrast paint does not equal the second contrast paint because it is not an opaque paint. So you're definitely going to want to, if you're using those GW primers, you're also going to want to get the base colors. And if you are using, some other primer at home, just make sure that you have, a thick, regular paint that is going to be able to cover that and get rid of that overage. I think you're going to have a lot of challenges using this on larger models. And in, what a lot of people have said, like large flat surfaces or large surfaces that don't really have a lot of detail. Ironically, like Space Marine shoulder pads seem to be like a bad place to use this, despite that being like their marquee thing that they are using as examples, because it all ends up pooling on the back. I haven't decided yet whether these are going to be getting converted into the dropper bottles or not. I also haven't tried out the medium yet to see what happens when you thin this stuff down further. Overall, so far, I like it. I'm kind of annoyed that one of the models that I was working on, I'm just not getting the results that I wanted, but it was also kind of it was experimental and I didn't know how it was going to come out. I was like, I'll try and do a big model with this and see what happens. And I kind of want to dump the whole thing in Simple Green and redo it. But I think I can work with it from where it currently is. I think it's salvageable. So, not dunking in a vat of Simple Green just yet. I also really need to do something about my lighting in here because it just looks like I have a halo right now, and that looks terrible. Yeah, so overall impression is I think you need to use it for the things that it's good for and understand that it's not an answer for everything. It's a tool in your toolbox. It is not going to be like, buy the set of contrast paints and then never use any other paints. That is not going to work. So I think that covers pretty much everything. That's just thoughts for now. I'll be posting up some results on social media eventually when I get some things done. And if I have any other thoughts or anything, I will come back with another video. But that's it for now. I'll talk to you all later.